we're going to move on to Chapter 8, and this deals with the history of education. And you must think, like we all do, well, why do we need to study the history of education? But one of the things that it'll do is help you see the origins of a lot of things we do, how they came to be, and one of the things that will challenge you on now and in the future as your teacher is, do some of these traditions and things we do still serve a purpose in education? One of my favorite pet peeve is the school year. The school year was built around an agrarian society where our entire country was built on agriculture. And so we started after the harvest in the fall, and when school ended in the spring before the planting started, so all the farm kids could be home and help the farm, the family, produce food for the rest of us. Well, evolved to the year 2009. Do you realize that less than 1% of the people in our country now live on farms and help produce the food? And even inside of that, many of the kids and many of the students children that come from those families aren't as integral in that family operation as they once were. But still, we don't go to school in the summer based on that one principle only, and that is the agrarian society. So that's one of the traditions, and now a number of things. Pay close attention to a lot of this because you're going to see some of this stuff on the test. We'll start a new section here on Chapter 8, and that is this here on Part 3, Forces Shaping Educational Policy and Practice. And this whole part is really, it gets very political now. And despite your political leanings, you'll find that this whole era it leans one way pretty heavily. But the first part here is on Chapter 8 is how do we get here, and this is that deals with the history of education. So let's take a look. The citizens of the United States have developed the most universal and popular system of education. If you don't believe that, look how many people come to our country for our universities and colleges. How many come to our country for freedom and what we teach in our schools. Come to view education as a public good that is essential to the health of the nation. And how did this happen? How did it come to feel like this? Well, you need to follow along with this to understand that. Focus questions. How do historians' personal values influence what they write? Why do some critics argue that American education has not always advantaged all learners? We'll take a look at that. We'll take a look at this. Which practices in today's schools are derived from European precedences? And this is out of your textbook, and I just want to put a sidebar on this also. These legacies that came, but these colonies are broken into those, as you would think, New England colonies, and also then the middle colonies, and certainly the southern colonies, and they all functioned a little bit different early on. And then we will look at these eras after how education changed. First of all, in the colony time, but then from the colony time to independence, and then independence to the Civil War, and then Civil War to the 1900 to World War II. We'll have those things to look at here. The real history of education may not tell a complete historical perspective of the United States. For example, as we follow along with history, there's very, very little mention of African American. Even after the emancipation, there's no mention in a lot of our history about what happened to these in their learning. Nothing still today really written about the emergence of educating Native Americans. And same now, this group, being the Hispanic, being the fastest growing immigrant group in our country, You still don't see people writing about this and talking about the integration of those. And you know, the females, women, you know, after suffrage was passed and stuff, but early on it was the focus of education was on boys, and you don't really see intentional, that's what we call that when you make those intentional changes that you would think you'd see. So educational history read was written by historians, and these are people, and that's what we forget, who sorted through data and selected what they viewed as significant. So these people, they select. They select. This is all history. All history is that. People sort through data and select what they view as significant. Just as you and I could, we would observe a same series of events, would have different reporting on what we saw. That's what makes history so challenging and interesting, but at the same time, it's people selecting after they sort through data. It is the responsibility of the reader, you, me, whomever, to question the assumption and the data of the educational historians and other history parts, as well as present day. It's absolutely no different today in reporting the news. Absolutely no different. Two different people listen to a news conference and will come out and they will sort through what was said and select what to report. You realize media and history are run together, that many things of history are gleaned from media reports. And how does the media come to report? People sort through and select what they, and also often interpret what it is. It needs to be a critical analysis by you, more than now, of all of what is included in the story and why, what stands to be gained. And this become even more relevant today because of the internet. Because we still want to assume, if we read it on the internet, it's factual. It says we always has, we'd open a textbook and we said to ourselves, hey, it's in the textbook, it must be factual, which is not true. But now, when everybody that can get on a computer could become an author on the internet, including you and I don't know about you, but I have created many web pages that can appear in any search that Google goes out looking for. You understand the vastness of this, how it's just people sorting through stuff and selecting what to report and what to write. That's a historical perspective. So is your response to the assertion that schools are failing, and do you think schools have been responsive to the needs of all groups in society? Give me one sentence on each of these, on your opinion, in your notes to get your points. I'm going to give you this a bunch. You can stop now and do this now. Hit the pause button. So first, the European legacy, and of course that's where almost all of it comes, is from Europe. Is all of us fair-skinned, all of us whites, if you will, have European descent, or of European descendants. Probably the most widely reported is European descent. Others came here, but it's so much more underreported that it a lot of times doesn't show up in our history books. So many educational traditions evolved from Europe practice, for example, like organizing content under major categories. What would they be? Math, science, reading, history, all under categories, and individual subjects. Teaching and instructional groups, like grades, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. Organizing schools in sequence of grades. Educating masses, like public education. Came from Europe. Planning for individual differences came from there. Schools should help, familiar educational traditions like schools should help learners develop rational thinking process, and we hear this mantra a lot about schools should teach thinking skills. Teachers should have specialized training, came from Europe. That they should have a degree, a accreditation, certification, license, and those things. Schools should prepare for responsible citizenship. This is one that people really like to debate. And schools should provide young people with understanding the skills needed in the adult workplace. Okay, so here's two big things here: workplace and citizenship, and sometimes can be conflicting. Well, what about this legacy? Well, here's some influences it's had on American education. Now, first of all, the Romans wanted young people to receive an education provided them with useful knowledge. And then they argued about whether students should be harshly punished or whether gentler, more sensitive approaches might be. Again, this is the Romans, and you'll want to make special note of this for these things, because that's one of the things that you're going to want to know when I test you on this. Tradition of churches taking responsibility for secular education also traces to this period. Did you know that most education originally was developed by churches? What is so hilarious to me about that is what we've done to push Jesus and God out of our schools now, when the origin of so many, especially our universities, were church related, almost exclusively. Universities were church and God related. The Middle Ages witnessed the development of important work that divided knowledge into those subject areas. And Reformation gave us a universal education that looked at all things. And here, this is a chance for you. You need to do a quick search on this, on the word Reformation, and it'll be a little church history. And this is where you get to give me one or two sentences about what the Reformation is about in church history. You write, to get your points, you need to respond to this. What is the Reformation? And that will help you understand how it fits into our educational system. But you have to understand what Reformation is. And many church leaders believe that the Bible was the repository of all wisdom. Hence, it was desirable for all to learn to read, that they might have access to the truths of that Bible. And that's what is why the churches got involved originally. That's why the churches got involved. The churches felt that if they didn't get involved, kids in this new land wouldn't learn to read, and therefore they wouldn't have access to the truths of the Bible. So that's why they got involved. Spread the word of God, that fulfill that great commission that Jesus taught: go forth and tell all the world the good news of His resurrection. Well, that was what church leaders were worried about in the new land. So we got to start school, teach kids to read. Later, during the Renaissance period, a growing emphasis on the worth and the importance of the individual evolved. And it's a little bit away from the Bible that doesn't touch anything about worth and importance of the individual. That's a secular thing. Me. That. Okay, and now here's some people, and again, as you'll notice, you're going to get to revisit some of these things, but Francis Bacon established the idea that truth can be challenged and modified through the observation and careful weighing of evidence. He was the first one to say we can test knowledge. And how can we do that? We modify and observe and weigh evidence. And Amos Comenius promoted the idea of organizing into sequential graded schools. That was his contribution. Then this Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi should take place in a caring atmosphere. That's the elementary teachers. Friedrich Froebel worked hard to convince people that they have well-planned educational experiences. Herbert, standardized format of lesson plans. That's a good one for you someday when you need to explain to a principal that it was Johann Friedrich Herbert that developed the standardized lesson plans. And if you're with us at DSU, you're going to get to write a few of these lesson plans in your time. And then we go to this on Native Americans, the part that's omitted. If you're going to go now, page 210 and 211, and give 2 to 3 sentences here about educating Native Americans. And again, this has to be part of the experience to get your points. You need to write about Native Americans and their educational systems. Not much, just a little report there out of your textbook. So then let's move into this colonial period to independence that in the colonies, what they're like, and here's some parts of it. So let's just jump into it. First of all, there's the three sets of colonies: the New England colonies, the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies. The New England colonies had these contributions. They were from the Church of England, was a state church. Hence, that separation of church and state was strong influence to here. And it gave, when they came up with the Constitution, it didn't say freedom from religion, it said freedom of. And this is what's so hilarious to me in this day and age when we've pushed Jesus and God out of our schools, is it never said that we're free from religion. It said you're free to practice, because in England, everybody had to belong to the state church. Hence, these people fled England, came to this country for freedom of religion, not from religion. There. No room for discussion about this, or if you disagreed in England about the church and state being together, then you're a dissenter, and then you're a threat to the government, and so you were in trouble. And so what did they do? They fled when they had a chance. And then the Puritans had some influence also. They had political problems. They wanted to reform church policies. Okay, and I asked you to study that a little bit. They wanted to expose their children to spiritual errors that were coming from that Church of England. They felt that the Church of England had evolved in a bad way, and now we're teaching spiritual errors. They too were looking for freedom of religion, and that led them to the New World. They established their own church and government here, and they still saw that Bible as a source of wisdom, and that was what their feeling was. The church had gotten away from the Bible as a source of wisdom. Hence, they were looking to be free of religious restriction, not from them. So, what was the Puritan influence? As we talked about earlier, they thought that they had to read to know truths from the Bible. They said the Bible has a specific type of government from both church and state. And in the Bible, if you're a Bible scholar at all, you know that the Bible, even Jesus himself, continually says, obey the government, obey the laws of the state, obey the government's the laws of the government, and that is the same as obeying God. And that's how they wanted to run it. They saw those as separate, government of church and state to be separate entities. And this is what happened in England, was they got to be the same thing, where the government made most decisions for the church. Okay, so they wanted freedom from that. Local churches exercised both political and moral power. That was from in the Church of England, that the church had political and moral power, and that wasn't well received. And that's where local control evolved from this, that there would be local school boards, so that the local people could run that instead of the states. And there was the Massachusetts School Law of 1642. We're still in this colonial period of the New England colonies. Make that clear. Charged local courts with ensuring that parents did not neglect education of kids. Required that children attend to school. This was the first called compulsory. You're going to want to know this. Compulsory attendance. Okay. And so this is the law that set up compulsory attendance, saying you have to attend school. First, it was in recent time, it was through 8th grade, like in my dad's time. It was in South Dakota, it was 16, and very recently it's moved to the age of 18, which has gotten some schools pretty nervous, because schools that have high amounts of dropouts now would say these kids have to stay till they're 18. Maybe a recipe for some disasters in schools. The kids want to leave and they can't. But compulsory attendance is meaning that it's compulsory that you attend school. The origin was Massachusetts School of Law, 1642. I wonder if that'll be on the test. And this is good too. The Old Deluder Satan Act of 1647. 1642, 1647 promoted education as a buffer against Satan's wiles, Satan's ways. What would do it? The education would require every town over 50 families to have a school and hire a teacher. Okay? Old Deluder Satan Act. If you have over 50 families in your community, you got to remember, the country's a baby yet. We haven't even had independence. It's a baby country. It's brand new. And so to avoid Satan's influence, if you have 50 families, now you have to have a teacher. And this is parents or community paid. It was the first public education that, because even though you're one of these 50 families, even if you didn't have kids of school age, you were concerned about Satan's wiles. And so they made a law. Old Deluder Satan Act. Got to have over 50 families, got to have a school. Still in the colonial period, New England. Okay, what's this? During that 17th century, during the 17th century, concern for publicly supported education of young children. Supported education referred only to the very basic education of young children. Few learners attended secondary school, which is, of course, went on to be known as the high school. And the small numbers of secondary schools did come into being during this time, when we first started to see high school. Otherwise, school really just ran through about 8th grade. They just kind of ran out. One of the most famous of this high schools was called the Boston Latin Grammar School, founded in 1635. Okay, prior to our, Massachusetts School Law and the Old Deluder Satan Act. It was prior to that. It was the first introduction of a high school, or at that time they called it a secondary school, Boston Latin Grammar School. The school had a specific purpose: prepare boys for Harvard. That was for university, for college. Okay, Harvard, and of course that was a religious, church-run school at that time. Now it's as secular can be. And that curriculum at this Boston Latin Grammar School consisted of difficult academic subjects like Latin and Greek and theology. Theology? Well, yeah, the study of the Bible, study of God. And that was because at Harvard was a religious school. And I say, no, you can't find God anywhere, I don't think, in Harvard now, but that was the origin of it. And this was called Boston Latin Grammar School. I wonder if that'll be on the test. Again, we're still in New England. Does that include? Well, one organization began to assume responsibility for the education of the young were dame schools. And this is where, the schools that were operated by a local woman, often a widow, who cared for children as young as 2 and taught them basic literacy. And what is that basic literacy? Well, stress the alphabet, the simple spelling, reading, and obviously some religious training, because they had to be able to read the Bible to know religious truths. Base their life on the religious truths of the Bible. Boys might be taught some simple things like math, and the girls some simple things like knitting and sewing. And of course, you know how well that would be received today. So we go to the middle counties. The middle counties were completely different. They had a whole different thing. They're a lot more diverse. A lot more countries represented in the middle counties: Dutch, Swedes, Scots, Irish. And because of that, everybody brought their traditions and their ideas of what school should look like. It was kind of mixed up. Like in New York, the merchants paid. The local merchants had wealth. They paid because they wanted the students in their area to, pursue business and trade. So they knew they had to have schooling. So they paid. Then Pennsylvania, the Quakers almost exclusively settled in Pennsylvania, and they still have their descendants there today. They were the first to be open to all children. To like African American, Native American, others, not encouraged or allowed in most schools. These groups weren't, but they were the first, what I call the first SPED school, and that is they included all. They were open to all, and that was their tradition. That you would come settle there because the kids would be welcome in the schools. Other than that, it seemed like they had to be from more affluent families. And then there was Ben Franklin. His proposal relating to the youth of Pennsylvania. He wanted them to be oriented to the real world, free religious ties, and so he started what's known as the Franklin Academy, that would be this continuation of school as a secondary school. And here's what he thought it should be: to have strong orientation towards practical rather than purely intellectual and theoretical thing. Do you remember back on the other ones, and then prior to that, they thought it should be preparing for Harvard, for religion, and those types of things. He wanted to be non-sectarian. He didn't want it to be religious-based. And he wanted to have a whole bunch of diverse course offerings. That the more diverse it was, the more practical it would be. So that would be the Franklin Academy. And then the southern colonies, and they ticked a little bit different also. They immigrated here as a result of the dangers in England, dangers to their wealth, and they settled along the rivers. Now, you that are history people, what did that mean? How would that make their life different that they settled along rivers? Anyone? 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 Well, yeah, it meant that they were shipping people and trading and trapping people in furs, but they had access along the rivers to put stuff on the boats and the ships and ship them back to England or to wherever. And with that, they didn't have many towns, and they had a lot of separation, and they had a real sparse population, made schools difficult. Remember we had the old Deluder law about if there was 50 families, they had to have a teacher. Well, they didn't have any of the communities along these rivers that had 50 families, so that wasn't an option. They were much, much smaller than that. Remember, the country was a baby. People were just coming here to settle. They were still in their first and second generation of people. And so the wealthy families that had settled there kind of took over, and they hired private tutors. And they continued to identify with the upper class of those English values. And if they're real wealthy, they sent them back to England. They either brought a tutor here from England, or they sent their kids back to England for their schooling. And so those that were less affluent just didn't have schooling. That these other groups was the first homeschoolers. If one of the parents or the parents could read, they taught the kids to read. Okay, and so that was how about the extent of their schooling, enough to read, because they were still Christian families at that time that saw the value of reading the Bible and having those spiritual truths. So the families that could read taught. Otherwise, the affluent ones had private tutors that they brought in themselves, or they sent their kids back to boarding school. So that is the end of the colonial period with the colonies. Remember, we said we had the New England colonies and the middle colonies and the southern colonies in that colonial period. Now we move up to independence, to the Civil War. What went on in this time? Well, these fellows here, and you get to study these a little bit in your definitions, their contributions. They're not much changed in those early years after this, because they were just worried about they had other things to do after they got here to this country. First of all, this thing of independence, settling that nation, providing workers, growing industries, getting a company going. They wanted to get the nation going. They broke away from England now. They had claimed their independence. There was not a lot of time to worry about education. And so their interest really became, because we're trying to get a nation started, get the children into workforce more than school. School was for the very young, and as soon as they could work, they worked. And of course, for the most part, on farms and growing food and those types of things. And the developments in secondary education were slow to happen. Mostly they were private, these academies. Who could afford academies? Mostly the wealthy. So, as you can imagine, that's who became educated, were the wealthy. And then there was this invention called this Boston English Classical School, which was that first public high school, low cost, kind of slow to catch on until about 1900. Then it started to outnumber, the high school started to outnumber the academies. But it might be on the test. What was the first public high school? The Boston English Classical. Classical meaning just regular stuff. also this time Workhorse Man, and he was a big one. I know there's a lot of schools named after him. He was an advocate for the common school, for that average kid, establishing a tax, the first supported public schools in the State Board of Education. First, in really, this is the first what I call the entitlement program. That you were entitled based on somebody else paying. And I recognized the need to educate teachers in schools, and those schools were called normal schools. Okay, that was what they were called. That was developed by Horace Mann. Anything that prepared teachers was called a normal school, and just about every state had one. Okay, this will help you remember this. DSU was originally known as General Beadle Normal School. DSU was founded and started exclusively to be a normal school to train teachers. Okay, and that costs money, but this Horace Mann was the first one in entitlement, said tax should support, let's levy a tax to pay for our school, and have State Board of Education to make decisions. And by 1860, 50% of American students in public schools, and by 1867 they had a national Department of Eds. Now the feds were involved. Okay. Horace Mann. Let's jump on to this Civil War to 1900. Had unprecedented industrial growth. The Industrial Revolution. Our country became a country of industries. So with that, okay, some of you study history, you know this, but with that, we needed more specific job training to run these industries. And that was the birth and the invention of vocational education. And vocational education is that you train specifically to get a vocational, to do a vocation. What do we have for vocations today? Welding, plumbers, electricians, carpenters. Those are vocations, and you can of course study that in the secondary schools. What was happening in immigration during this time from Civil War to 1900? Well, this was a time of a lot of immigrations. And so the school's answer to many, many immigrants was to try and Americanize them. In fact, there was movies made about this, especially with the Native Americans, to make them, try and make them more Americanized, cut their hair and be like Americans. And of course, as you know, it kind of backfired. So when we had this Kalamazoo case that ruled that states had the right to levy tax to pay public education. Who was that first came up with that idea? Anyone? Bueller? Yeah, Horace Mann. And it became up also more practical work-related classes offered. Why? Because of this growth of the Industrial Revolution. And this was the same era was the formation of the NEA and AFT. And what do those stand for? Anyone? Well, this you're going to get to write this out in your notes. Right. Tell me what those two things stand for. Okay, and then the Committee of 10 was introduced, served the school's primary purpose to prepare students for college. Okay, how do you think that went over? The self-appointed group, the Committee of 10, that their purpose was to prepare for college when we're in this Industrial Revolution time. Not very well. And then let's jump. We leave up to 1900 so 1900 to World War I, and this was really the junior high is proposed, and that was to help prepare for high school. And of course, because you remember they were jumping from elementary to high school, and so there was some need for an intermediate in there. And John Dewey came on the scene, and you cannot have studied any psychology or ed psychology without some acclamation to John Dewey. He felt that school process brought students participate in society. Okay, so that's what he thought they should do. Schools should care about the individual learners and produce secure human beings. Remember, before this we taled about it should prepare for work, and it should prepare for, first of all, is to read the Bible, go to college, all those different things. But Dewey come along and said they just, first of all, school should prepare for secure human beings. I believe that every learner longs to explore their world. He invented this scientific problem-solving method. Okay, that you must master that scientific problem-solving thing. Again, here's another thing I'm going to ask you to look up is this term, scientific problem-solving method. That's in your definitions, and if you don't understand this does not make any sense. So you have to know what that scientific problem-solving method is. Okay, and that came from Dewey. It's on the test. The 1900 to the World War II were also that introduction of the testing movement. This is when we first started this initiatives. So this was the first school reform. And it seems like since then we're in a constant state of reform. Okay, what's a reform? Well, I'll give you one. No Child Left Behind. That is a school reform based on testing movements that started pre-war time. It continues to Alfred Binet established the IQ test. You'll sometimes had referred to the Binet test. It tests IQ, where you decide, that average is 100, and 70% of the people are between 35 above and 35 below. 70% of the people's IQ would fall within one norm each way. That's a whole other time before. And the whole idea of this IQ test was predict success in school. First example of cultural bias on this test, because different groups, it was written by the Westerners, the Europeans, and a lot of the other cultures didn't understand. It had different values, different approaches to it. And at this same time, they came up with the cardinal principles. And again, you're going to want to get familiar with this term for many reasons. And the cardinal principles said, hey, let's come up with just general concerns for school. Let's get away from these very pigeonholed things of, what school's for, like to read the Bible, to be good workers, to contribute to society, the individual. Let's come up with general purposes, the cardinal principles, general. Comprehensive high school, introduced during this time, promotes student development. And this was the introduction of the progressive movement. That there's still some of this along, but this brought on compulsory attendance laws, meaning that there was some put into law that there was some consequence, and established counselors in schools as a result of Dewey. Remember, Dewey was during this time, and he said, gee, if we're going to develop the whole person, remember Dewey? Going to develop the whole person, we really should have counselors. Now, little did he know that the counselors would end up being the glorified college entrance people. At least that's my bias. It seems like a number of the counselors I know got mirrored down in the muck with administrative things instead of counseling. But this was based on Dewey's assertion that we need to develop people as individuals. And so sometimes they need to talk to a counselor. How you feeling today? Counseling. Have you ever been in counseling? How you feeling today? How do you feel about that? Counseling. Here's a quick look at these cardinal principles that are in your textbooks, and there was 7 of them. Health and command a fundamental process, worthy home membership, meaning your family, because Dewey felt that was important. Vocational preparation, that is a skill. And citizenship meant country. You are committed to your country. Worthy use of leisure time. How to handle your free time. And ethical character. Okay. So what we did was to really, is that point, start to scrub God out of our schools, and this is where you put in like ethical character, meaning based on spiritual values, but he can't be there. So kind of look how general this is. Health, fundamental process of body and stuff. So health and body and family and a skill and serve your country, manage your free time, and have, be in the Word, have spiritual guidance, which is ethical character. So that was what they came up with that time, the cardinal principles. I wonder if that's going to be on the test. So then, this was 1900 to World War II. Now let's go to World War II to the 21st century, present day. Isn't that kind of cool? I got these images. That's kind of a new thing. Established life adjustment education. After the war, seemed encouraged to do whatever they wanted. Not as much rigor. Not very hard. School was too hard at that point. They thought it was too hard, so let's go to this life adjustment. This was the progressive people, the progressive movement saying, this is how it's changed. And this didn't last long because you know what they found? That the kids didn't do much. They did whatever they wanted. They didn't want to do much. So they found they needed to put some rigor back. And this came on the scene that made that happen for Sputnik. The Soviet Union challenged U.S. technology supremacy here. The Sputnik was the first rocket into space. Was the first spaceship. And it was the Russians had it from Russia. The Soviet Union. And so this was the alarm. And what happened when that happened? Immediately they said, it's the schools. It's the schools. Where have you heard that before? This is what we do when there's problems. We blame it on the schools. So we say there's not enough math and science because the Russians got that ship up first, Sputnik. You want to put that in part of your vocabulary in your study because, again, I can assure you this will be on the test. But the Soviets got that up there first. And so with that was the first big act, federal piece of legislation, put some money with it, but it was the government's reaction to Sputnik. They provided the first dollars for school reform. It's one of those initiatives we talked about. And really our schools have been in a constant state of reform since Sputnik. Because every time they spend a bunch of money, they make federal laws. We'll look a little bit more. The most recent is No Child Left Behind. The new administration, they were sure, his constituents were sure that that thing would crash and burn. And so far, he is saying he's not even going to touch it. Maybe tweak it a little bit, which is shocking to some of his supporters who thought sure he would set the thing on fire. In fact, he's coming up with some other things that I think are going to challenge people even more than No Child Left Behind. But this National Defense Act failed on many fronts because anytime you have top-down, it creates some problems. And they didn't get the results they wanted. Okay, life adjustment, do whatever you want. Sputnik comes along, the Russians get a spaceship up before we do. It must be the school's fault. We should kill them all, but we can't, so we'll just give them more money. As they react to Sputnik, they put federal dollars to reform the schools, but it didn't work. Okay. Also during this time was the advent of middle school. Supports interdisciplinary approaches to education, favor motivational techniques. Those of you that didn't come from middle school, that came from junior high, they're not the same. Their ages are the same, but they have a philosophical difference that's quite pronounced, and that is that things should work together. And people should work together. Cooperation rather than completion of things. And then some more school improvement initiatives over the year, like more rigor, teacher quality has to improve, you need instructional leadership in the principal, you should maybe have a longer school year, and improve teacher working conditions. All were initiatives, reform and improvement initiatives between World War II and present day. And then this testing and curriculum standards came on to increase the focus on content learners are taught. That's curriculum. And reliance on test results to prove achievement. Aha. Hence, No Child Left Behind. And then curriculum standards, specific content to be taught in specific grades, expected levels of proficiencies, and we demand now that all schools have curriculum standards. All states have curriculum standards. And so here are some of those. National Goals Panel was an initiative. This National Council on Educational Standards and Testing came into play. This was President Clinton's Goals 2000, Educate America Act, and of course the most previous administration, National Education Standards Improvement Act, No Child Left Behind. Okay, so you see, No Child Left Behind wasn't the first, even though they wanted to kill that president. You'll see we had many before here. They just never had teeth. How about African American education? Well, Civil War ended 1865. 4 million slaves were now free. Okay, picture this. How many? 4 million, roughly 20% of those are school-aged kids. Booker T. Washington describes the situation as an entire race trying to go to school. So also a million, roughly a million or close to a million trying to get involved. And some ex-slaves opened Sabbath schools designed to provide at least an elementary education. However, in the post-Civil War period, the South was unreceptive to the education of African Americans, and most of the northern states continued the practice of segregated education. So what does that mean? Well, the South is a little hot yet. They're a little mad. Why is the South mad about this Emancipation Proclamation? Well, right, because the South predominantly is one that owns slaves. Okay? And when the slaves would come north up here, the people of the northern states say, sure, come on in, but here, your school's over here, the neighborhood school's over here. And these barriers designed to discourage African American education retain their faith in education, because they could see how important that was. And where does it lead to? Well, it was Brown versus the Board of Education in '54 said the little black girl can go to the neighborhood school. When the community had said, you need to go down there, down the street to the school with the black children. Okay. 1890 in St. Louis, a larger percentage of the African American population was attending school than the white population. That's scary, isn't it? In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson upheld the separate but equal doctrine that continued segregated schools as the dominant pattern of education until that famous Brown versus Board of Education. And this is one, rain, sleet, or shine today, and 30 years from now, you're going to expect it to know what impact Brown versus Board of Education had on. Because it's probably the most famous piece of legislation in school history. Said the little black girl can go to the neighborhood school. She doesn't have to go down to the segregated school. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson said, as long as it's an equal school, it's okay if it's separate. Brown versus the Board of Education really kind of struck that down. Said, separate is not equal. It can be equal, but it can't be separate. Here's some other legacies from Islam. They had they bring some traditions to schools. It's interesting. The Muslims now, it's so funny because we'll recognize Muslims in our school that they can have the all kinds of traditions in their school that the Christians are not. That I think in the first time in your life, and I don't know how many of you are Christian, but there's going to be an all-out war declared on anything Christian. Be very unpopular. In fact, there was a poll out the other day that said less people are identifying themselves as Christian now than ever before in the history of our country. And for one thing, it's not very popular to be. It's very popular and very chic to be to have Islam or Confucianism or something like that. But the Christians are going to take a beating, and it's dropped since this president has done nothing to change that. Here's some things from the legacies of China, Confucianism. They've brought some things to this to the table also. And Hinduism also gets their say in our schools. Okay. So again, I think I would pay some particular attention to these summaries, do a very nice job of encapsulating this whole chapter here. Here's Kalamazoo. Here's the reflections. Here's where I want you to respond. Here's the first one. Reflection 1. What do you consider to be educational practices that no longer address important educational needs? I gave you one, and that is the school year. You come up with at least one other practice that we no longer address educational needs of our society. And here's the next one I want you to reflect on and respond to. What are those contemporary issues that are likely to lead to important educational changes? You think of all, review contemporary issues in education and see if you can come up with that. Okay? So you have to have those two to get your points. So that's Chapter 8, History of Education. How did we get here?